March 1984, Webster City, Iowa. The kind of small place where the wind seems to find every gap in your coat, and where people can tell how your week is going just by the way you walk into the post office. Sarah Mitchell was 35, and she had learned to smile the way you learn to tie a knot, tight, practiced, and meant to hold even when your hands are shaking. She had 2 kids. Tommy was 9 and Lisa was 6. And that morning she had stood at the sink rinsing the same cereal bowls with the same motion, while her mind counted backward like a clock with teeth. 11 days until rent. $350. $42 in her purse. She kept doing the math anyway, as if the right combination of numbers might soften. Her ex-husband had been gone 3 years, somewhere out in California last she heard. And the child support never came, not once, not even a check that bounced. For 10 years she'd been a stay-at-home mom, the kind of work that keeps a household running, but leaves no line on a resume anyone wants to read. Before marriage she'd waitressed for a while, nothing fancy. Long shifts and sore feet and tips that disappeared into groceries. In 1984, in Iowa, with jobs scarce and everyone hiring their cousin's cousin, no experience might as well have been a stamp on your forehead. She'd started applying anyway. Because when your kids ask why the milk is gone, you don't get to sit and feel sorry for yourself. You move. The first rejection was quick and polite, the kind that burns because it's delivered like a routine. At Henderson Farm Supply, the personnel manager glanced at her application, and his face decided for him before his mouth did. He didn't even pretend to consider it. "We need someone with experience." He said it like he was reading weather. She had nodded, thanked him, and walked out as if she wasn't swallowing a lump the size of a stone. Second rejection, third, fourth. She kept collecting them like bruises you can't explain, because no one hit you. The feed mill didn't want a woman for men's work. The grocery store acted like 10 years out of the workforce meant she'd forgotten how to learn. The bank wanted certifications. The gas station wanted references. The elementary school cafeteria told her it would take 6 weeks and $200 to get the right paper. And Sarah smiled again. Because what else do you do when someone asks if you can buy time you don't have? By the 7th rejection, her hands were still clean, her nails trimmed, her coat still brushed. But inside she was starting to fray. She would sit in her car afterward with the engine off, because gas cost money, and she'd stare at her steering wheel until her eyes blurred. She wasn't lazy. She wasn't stupid. She wasn't asking for a handout. She just needed someone to look past the blank space on the page and see the person who would show up early and do what needed doing, because quitting wasn't an option when 2 little lives depended on you. But the town didn't see that. The town saw no experience and heard, "Not our problem," at home. She kept it from the kids the way parents do, by making everything sound normal. She'd pack lunch with whatever was left, cut an apple into thin slices so it looked like more, and joke with Tommy about his spelling test and remind Lisa to tie her shoes. At night after they fell asleep, she'd sit at the kitchen table with the bills laid out, palms flat like she could press them into behaving. The rent notice sat on top like a threat that didn't need raising its voice. She'd tell herself, "Tomorrow I'll find something. Tomorrow I'll fix this." And then tomorrow would come, and the same doors would close. On March 23rd, the desperation had turned into something sharper, something that made her feel almost numb. She went to the post office because there was still a chance, ridiculous as it felt, that something might be waiting in her box, a reply, a check, a miracle. The lobby smelled like paper and cold air. That's where she saw it, a handwritten sign taped crookedly to the bulletin board. The letters pressed hard as if the writer had been impatient with the pen. Farm help needed. Apply at Jensen Farm, 6 miles east on Highway 20. Sarah stared at it longer than she should have. Farm help. She had grown up in Des Moines. She'd never driven a tractor, never worked cattle, never baled hay. And if you asked her to tell corn from soybeans, she'd have hesitated. But the sign didn't say experience required. It didn't say must have references. It didn't say no single mothers. It just said needed. She stood there thinking of her kids' faces and the calendar on the wall, with the rent date circled like a bruise. Then she tore the little phone number slip off the bottom of the paper. Even though she didn't plan to call, She didn't have time to call. She had to go. Her car was a 1976 Chevette that burned oil and complained if you asked it to do anything beyond limp. She put the key in the ignition and listened to it catch, the engine sounding tired. And she drove out of town with her knuckles white on the steering wheel. The road east on Highway 20 stretched through flat fields, still half asleep from winter. The sky was low and gray, and the wind kept shoving at the car like it wanted to push her back. Every mile, she tried to talk herself out of it. What am I doing? They'll laugh. He'll take one look and send me away. And then she'd picture Tommy and Lisa, and she'd keep going, because being embarrassed was a luxury compared to being homeless. Jensen Farm sat back from the road, a neat spread of 500 acres that looked cared for in a way that made you think of someone who tightened bolts and swept floors because that was how he lived, not because anyone was watching. A white farmhouse, a red barn, an equipment shed. Sarah parked on the gravel and got out, and the wind immediately found the thinness of her skirt. She smoothed it down, because old habits die hard, and walked toward the shed. Inside, a man in his late 50s was bent over a tractor, sleeves rolled up, hands dark with grease, the set of his shoulders saying he'd been working before most people had breakfast. He looked up when he heard her footsteps. His face was weathered, gray hair, eyes that didn't waste time. He didn't smile, but he didn't scowl either. He just looked. Sarah felt that look take inventory, city shoes, clean hands, hair pinned back. A woman who didn't belong in this shed. She forced her voice to stay steady. Excuse me. I saw the sign. I'm here about the job. The man wiped his hands on a rag. Farm help, he said, like he was confirming the category of her existence. Yes, sir, Sarah said. He studied her a moment longer. You know anything about farming? The question hit her exactly where every other question had hit her. Her throat tightened. She could have lied. She could have tried to dress it up, make it sound like she knew more than she did. But she was too tired for pretending, and she could see that this man would hear the truth anyway. No, sir, she said. His eyebrows didn't move. Ever driven a tractor? No, sir. Worked cattle? No. Baled hay? No. Each answer felt like a nail. The man tilted his head, not unkind, but skeptical. Then why are you applying for farm work? Sarah felt the tears rise so fast it scared her, like her body had been waiting for permission to break. She fought them back because she'd cried in enough parking lots for one lifetime. She swallowed hard. Because I need a job, she said. And now the words came out like they'd been locked behind her ribs. I've applied everywhere in Webster City. No one will hire me because I don't have experience. I'm not asking you to pretend I do. I'm asking you to give me a chance. I'll learn. I'll do whatever you need. I have 2 kids to feed and I'm 11 days from being evicted. I will work harder than anyone you've ever hired if you just let me. She hated how raw it sounded, hated that she was standing in the cold begging. But she hated the alternative more. The man's eyes stayed on her face, and for a second, the shed was very quiet except for the wind rattling the metal siding. Sarah could see him weighing things that weren't on her application, the way her jaw clenched, the way her hands trembled but didn't hide, the way she didn't try to charm her way out of the truth. He exhaled slowly, like someone letting go of an assumption. Then he asked a different question, one that cut through the usual hiring nonsense like a blade. If I hire you, he said, and the work gets hard and it will get hard, will you quit? Sarah didn't answer right away, not because she needed time to think, but because the question landed somewhere deeper than her fear. She looked at him, really looked, and she understood that this was the only moment that mattered. This wasn't about tractors or hay. This was about whether she would disappear when she got tired. Whether she'd show up when no one was watching. She thought about the rent, the empty fridge, Tommy's long legs sticking out from under his blanket at night, Lisa's small hand in hers when they crossed the street. She thought about all the doors that had shut, and she felt something settle in her chest, heavy and steady. No, sir, she said. I won't quit. I can't quit. My kids depend on me. The man nodded once like he'd heard what he needed. Okay, he said. I'll hire you. Sarah blinked, sure she'd misheard. $6 an hour. 40 hours a week. I'll teach you what you need to know, but you work hard and you don't complain." He paused. "Deal." Her breath came out shaky. "Deal," she managed. The relief hit her so hard her knees almost gave. "When do I start?" she asked, because if she stopped to feel too much, she might fall apart. "Monday," he said. 6 a.m., wear boots. Work clothes. That skirt won't last 10 minutes. She nodded like a soldier receiving orders. She walked back to her car, and when she shut the door, she finally let herself cry. But it wasn't the same crying she'd done after the rejections. This was relief, mixed with fear, mixed with the strange sensation of being seen. She drove home with her cheeks wet and her hands steady on the wheel. That weekend she went to Goodwill and bought what she could afford. Boots that were a size too big, but thick enough to protect her feet. Men's work jeans because they were cheaper. 3 work shirts that smelled faintly of old detergent. She counted out the bills carefully, knowing that spending money to earn money felt like a gamble when you only had $42 to start with. But she also knew she couldn't show up on a farm in city shoes. On Monday morning, she woke before the alarm because anxiety doesn't need electronics. The house was dark. She moved quietly so she wouldn't wake the kids, made coffee she barely tasted, and stood for a second in the doorway of their room listening to their breathing. She wanted to tell them everything, to promise them it would be okay, but she'd learned you don't promise until you've earned it. She wrote a note for Tommy with simple instructions for the morning, kissed Lisa's forehead gently, and left. The Chevette started on the second try. She drove through the sleeping streets of Webster City while the sky was still black-blue. And she arrived at Jensen Farm at 5:55 a.m. 5 minutes early, because being early was the only advantage she had. The yard was already alive with the sound of metal and distant engines. Frank Jensen, because that was his name. She'd learned it from the sign, was already working, as if 6 a.m. was a suggestion for other people. He glanced at her when she stepped into the shed. "You're early," he said. "Good." It wasn't praise, not exactly, but Sarah felt it like oxygen. He walked her through the basics without wasting words, where things were kept, how equipment was checked, how you didn't leave tools lying around because time lost was money lost, and on a farm money lost could turn into disaster. He showed her gauges, fuel, grease fittings, the language of machines that had never been spoken in her house. Sarah listened like her life depended on it, because it did. Her first task was simple: clean the machine shed, sweep, organize tools, put things where they belonged. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest, and it mattered because Frank had said organization saves time and time saves crops. By noon, her back ached. By mid-afternoon, her hands had blisters from gripping a broom and hauling boxes of parts. The cold that had bitten her in the morning gave way to a thin sweat under her shirt, and the smell of oil and dust worked into her hair. She didn't complain because she'd promised. More than that, she didn't complain because complaining wouldn't change anything. At home that night, she soaked her hands in warm water while Tommy told her about school, and Lisa asked if she'd bring home a baby cow someday. And Sarah laughed because the idea was ridiculous and because laughing kept her from crying. After they slept, she sat at the kitchen table and stared at her blistered palms and felt something unfamiliar. Pride, small but real. The next day, Frank put her in the seat of an old John Deere 3020 and told her what to do with the clutch and the gears like it was the most normal thing in the world, that a woman who'd been washing dishes 2 days ago was now learning to drive a tractor. Sarah stalled it. Then she stalled it again. She could feel her face heat up, not from the engine, but from the awareness of how she must look. She imagined the town already writing the ending for her. She quit. She fail. She crawl back. Frank didn't laugh. He didn't roll his eyes. He just said, again, like the machine wasn't the only thing that needed starting. The third try it jerked forward, rough and ugly, but it moved. Sarah gripped the wheel until her fingers hurt and kept going, because every foot of ground she covered felt like stealing something back from the life that had been shrinking her. That's where the real story began, not at the post office, not at the sign, not even at the question, but in those moments when the work stopped being an idea and became a weight she had to carry. And the only thing that could keep her upright was the promise she'd made in a cold shed to a man who didn't do sympathy, only truth. Frank Jensen didn't ease her into the week the way people sometimes do when they expect you to fail. He didn't soften instructions or lower standards. If anything, the days after that first morning came faster and heavier, as if the farm itself wanted to see what she was made of before it bothered to remember her name. Sarah learned quickly that farm work wasn't a single skill you mastered and then coasted on. It was a chain of small necessary things that all mattered, and missing one could cost you hours or worse. Frank talked while he worked, not lecturing, just explaining as if she were meant to understand. He showed her how to check oil levels before turning a key, how to listen to an engine instead of just looking at it, how to feel for vibration that meant something wasn't right. He explained why tools went back to the same place every time, because when you were racing daylight, you didn't want to be searching for a wrench while clouds rolled in. Sarah absorbed it the way thirsty ground takes rain, storing details in her head because she couldn't afford to forget. When he wasn't teaching, he put her to work. Cleaning became organizing. Organizing became learning what each thing was for. By the end of the second day, she could tell a grease fitting from a fuel line and knew which tractors were temperamental in the cold. She went home each night so tired her bones hummed, but she also went home knowing exactly what she'd done that day, which felt better than any polite rejection ever had. By Wednesday, Frank had her moving equipment around the yard, positioning wagons so they'd be ready when needed. Backing a trailer was nothing like driving the car, and Sarah jackknifed one badly enough that her heart slammed into her throat. She froze, waiting for the disappointment she was sure was coming. Frank walked over, looked at the angle and said, "Everyone does that at first. Pull forward. Try again." No sigh, no lecture. Just instruction. The second try was better. The third was almost right. Sarah felt the knot in her chest loosen a fraction. Word traveled faster than she expected. Webster City was small enough that people noticed when something didn't fit their picture of how things were supposed to be. By the end of the week, she could feel eyes on her when she stopped for gas on the way home, the curiosity sharpened by doubt. A woman working at Jensen Farm? The divorced one? The one with no experience? She heard fragments when she passed by, felt conversations pause. It stung, but it also hardened something in her. If they were watching, she'd give them something to watch. Friday afternoon, Frank took her out to the fields. The land still looked bare, but he talked about what would come, about soil types and moisture, about timing that mattered more than effort. He knelt and scooped up dirt, rubbing it between his fingers, explaining what it told him. Sarah copied the motion, embarrassed by how little she knew but unwilling to pretend otherwise. That night she fell asleep with her hands aching and dreams full of engines and open sky. Over the weekend she bought a cheap notebook and started writing things down, not trusting her memory alone. She wrote after the kids went to bed, the kitchen quiet except for the scratch of her pen. Tommy wandered in once and asked what she was doing. "Learning to be a farmer," she said, half joking, half terrified. He grinned like she'd said something brave. Monday came again, and with it a sense of routine that felt almost dangerous, like getting used to standing on the edge of something. Frank taught her to run the disc, to prepare fields for planting. The tractor became less of an enemy and more of a stubborn partner. She drove for hours, sun on her neck, wind drying sweat on her skin, her thoughts narrowing to the rhythm of the work. Blisters hardened into calluses. Sunburn faded into tan. She learned how exhaustion could be managed if you didn't waste energy on complaining. Frank noticed. He didn't say much, but sometimes he'd glance her way and nod, which felt like more than praise. Planting season arrived like a test she hadn't known she'd been studying for. Frank showed her the planter, how to fill it with seed, how to check depth and spacing, how to watch gauges that could ruin a field if you ignored them. The days stretched longer. They started early and ended late, and Sarah found herself measuring time not by clocks, but by acres finished. Frank's usual crew was smaller that year, and with Sarah's help they moved faster than expected. When they finished planting the 500 acres days ahead of schedule, Frank said, "You work as hard as 2 men." He said it matter-of-factly, but Sarah felt it settle somewhere deep. Rent got paid. Groceries filled the fridge again. The fear that had lived in her chest for months loosened enough for her to breathe. Month 2 brought new lessons. Frank showed her how to maintain equipment beyond the basics, how to change oil and filters, how to sharpen blades, how to tension belts so they didn't slip at the worst time. Her hands were constantly dirty now. Grease worked into lines that soap couldn't touch, and she stopped caring. She started caring about other things instead. Doing it right, doing it once, not having to be told twice. She took her notebook everywhere, adding sketches and notes, studying at night like a student who knew failing wasn't an option. Summer came, and with it cultivating, careful work between rows that required attention and patience. Frank trusted her with equipment that cost more than she could imagine owning, and she felt the weight of that trust every time she turned the key. Other farmers noticed. Comments shifted from disbelief to grudging respect. "She's still there," someone said at the diner. "She's running equipment," someone else said at the feed mill. Frank didn't defend her. He didn't need to. He just said, "She's good." August brought harvest, and harvest brought machines that dwarfed everything she'd touched before. The combine was a monster of levers and controls, and the thought of operating it made her stomach flutter. Frank handed her the manual and said, "Read it." She did, cover to cover, then read it again. The first time she climbed into the cab, she sat for a moment with her hands on the wheel, breathing. She remembered the question he'd asked in the shed months earlier, and the answer she'd given without hesitation. This was what that answer looked like. Within a week, she was running the combine competently enough that Frank left her in the field while he hauled grain. They worked dawn to midnight, days blurring into each other, exhaustion settling into muscle memory. One night the combine broke down in the field, a bearing screaming before giving out. Frank came out and inspected it, shook his head. "That's it for tonight," he said. "We'll fix it tomorrow." Sarah hesitated, then asked, "Can you show me how to fix it now?" Frank looked at her, surprised. It was late, cold, and they were both tired. "You want to learn this at 10:30 at night?" he asked. Sarah nodded. "If I can fix it next time, I can save you time and money." Frank laughed, not unkindly, and handed her a flashlight. They worked until 1 in the morning, replacing the bearing piece by piece, Frank explaining each step, Sarah memorizing the feel of it. She drove home exhausted, slept a few hours, and came back at 6 like nothing had happened. Harvest lasted 30 days. Sarah worked every single one. Frank paid her overtime without being asked. By October, she'd been there 7 months. She'd saved money, caught up on bills, bought coats for the kids before winter hit. Life felt stable in a way it hadn't in years. When Frank called her into the office one afternoon, her stomach tightened anyway. Stability was new enough that she didn't trust it. He closed the door and sat across from her. "I need to talk to you about something," he said. Sarah braced herself. "I'm getting older," he continued. "I need help managing this place. You've proven yourself. I want you to be assistant farm manager." The words took a second to land. Assistant manager. 7 months ago, she'd been counting coins. Now this. Frank named the pay, explained the responsibilities, talked about planning and coordination. Sarah listened, stunned. "You've learned more in 7 months than most people learn in 7 years," he said. "You work hard. You're reliable. You care about doing it right." She said yes before fear could catch up. November came, and with it new responsibilities. She learned about finances, crop marketing, strategic planning, the parts of farming that happened on paper and in conversations rather than in fields. In 1985, Frank gave her more autonomy. She managed the planting crew, negotiated with suppliers, organized maintenance schedules that saved time and money. The farm had its best year in a decade. Profits rose. Frank credited her openly, which made her uncomfortable and proud at the same time. In 1986, he promoted her to farm manager. The title felt heavy, but she carried it. She earned more than she ever had, enough to buy a reliable used car and move into a better rental where each kid had their own room. Tommy and Lisa grew into the kind of kids who knew their mother worked hard and didn't quit. In 1987, Frank started talking about retirement. He didn't have kids interested in farming, and the future of the land weighed on him. One fall afternoon, he made her an offer that left her speechless. He wanted to sell her the farm, owner financed, paid over 20 years. The price was below market. The down payment was more money than she'd ever imagined having at once. She told him she couldn't afford it. He asked how much she had. When she told him, he nodded. "That'll do," he said. "You've earned it." Sarah cried then, openly, because 3 years earlier she'd been begging for a job with $42 to her name. And now she was being offered a future she hadn't dared to imagine. They signed papers in January of 1988. Frank stayed on as a consultant while she transitioned into ownership, guiding when needed, stepping back when she didn't. By spring, she was running everything independently. She hired people the way Frank had hired her, asking one question that mattered. She paid well, treated people with respect, and watched them stay. The farm thrived. By 1990, it was grossing hundreds of thousands annually. She paid down debt aggressively, refinanced smartly, and owned the land outright years ahead of schedule. Tommy joined the operation after college, learning the same lessons she had. Lisa became a veterinarian, still helping during busy seasons. In 2008, Sarah retired, selling the farm to her son the same way Frank had sold it to her, because some things were worth passing on exactly as they were given. Frank Jensen died in 2009. At his funeral, the church was full. Sarah stood and told her story, not as a fairy tale, but as a record of what happens when someone looks past a resume and asks the right question. She said that Frank saved her life in 1984, 11 days before eviction, 7 rejections deep. He asked if she would quit when it got hard. She said no. She kept that promise for 24 years. And because of that, everything changed. By the time spring rolled fully into summer, the novelty of Sarah Mitchell still working at Jensen Farm had worn off for everyone except Sarah herself. Because for her, the work never became easy, it only became familiar. And familiarity didn't soften the strain so much as reveal it more clearly. The days blurred together in a way that made it hard to remember what life had felt like before she measured time by fuel levels and weather forecasts. But the pressure underneath never disappeared. It changed shape. Early on, the fear had been about money and eviction and survival. Now it was about something quieter and heavier, the fear of proving everyone right. Every morning when she pulled into the gravel yard, she carried that unspoken challenge with her, the sense that one bad mistake could still turn the story back in the direction everyone expected. She had learned enough to know how much she didn't know, and that knowledge made her careful, sometimes too careful. Frank noticed when she hesitated and would remind her that machinery respected decisiveness more than doubt. She tried to listen. She tried to trust herself. But trust is harder to build than skill. The work grew more demanding as the season progressed. Cultivating required precision. Long hours staring down rows that all looked the same until they didn't, until a moment of inattention could undo a week of effort. Sarah focused so hard her jaw ached, correcting tiny errors before they became big ones, replaying Frank's instructions in her head like a recording she couldn't pause. At home, the kids saw less of her, and when they did see her, she was often quiet, conserving energy. Tommy started helping more without being asked. Lisa fell asleep waiting for her sometimes. Sarah told herself it was temporary, that this was what building something looked like, but guilt crept in anyway, because guilt is efficient like that. She had one neighbor she trusted, Mrs. Anderson, who watched the kids when schedules overlapped or emergencies came up, and Sarah hated how often she had to ask. By June, the heat had settled in thick and heavy, and so had the scrutiny. The men who had laughed early on had mostly stopped, but that didn't mean they approved. Some of them watched her work now with narrowed eyes, waiting for the slip, the moment they could say they'd known it all along. Sarah felt it and pretended she didn't, because acknowledging it would give it power. She focused on the job. Then came June 12th, the day that nearly broke her. It started wrong before she ever left the house. Tommy woke up burning with fever, cheeks flushed, eyes glassy. Sarah stood in the doorway holding a thermometer, her stomach sinking as the numbers climbed. She checked the clock, did the math she was always doing now, not with dollars, but with trust. She hadn't missed a day yet. She hadn't asked for favors. She called Mrs. Anderson with a tight voice and explained, and the older woman agreed to watch him, clucking softly about kids and bugs in schools. Sarah hung up and felt like she'd already failed something important. She kissed Tommy's forehead, promised she'd be back early, and left with her chest tight and her thoughts scattered. At the farm, the morning unfolded like a test designed to find every weakness she had. She was running the cultivator when a hydraulic line burst without warning, spraying fluid and forcing her to shut everything down. She stared at the mess, heart pounding, hands shaking as she tried to remember what Frank had shown her. She attempted a fix, then realized she was out of her depth. Calling Frank felt like admitting defeat, but she did it anyway because the field couldn't wait. He arrived, fixed it in minutes, and said calmly, "Hydraulics are tricky. You'll get there." His lack of frustration almost made it worse, because it left her alone with her own. Later that morning, she backed a grain wagon too sharply and bent the hitch against a fence post. The sound of metal protesting rang in her ears. She stopped, closed her eyes, and waited for the wave of shame to pass. Frank came over again, inspected the damage, and said it would take time to fix. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't sigh. He just did the work. At lunch, Sarah tried to eat and couldn't. Her hands wouldn't stop trembling. When she went to leave the yard, her car refused to start. The battery clicked uselessly. She stood there for a moment, forehead resting on the steering wheel, fighting the urge to scream. Frank jumped it without comment. In the afternoon, as if the day weren't finished with her yet, she broke a disc blade on a rock she hadn't seen, costing another hour. By 4 o'clock, the list of things she'd done wrong felt unbearable. She replayed them in her head, stacking them until they felt like proof. Proof that she wasn't cut out for this. Proof that she'd gotten lucky for a while, and now the truth was catching up. When Frank called her into the office at the end of the day, she was sure this was it. She sat down across from him, hands clasped tightly, and started apologizing before he could speak. She told him she'd pay for the damages, that she understood if he needed to let her go, that she was sorry. Frank blinked at her, genuinely confused. "Pay for what?" he asked. She listed everything, the hitch, the fence post, the blade, her voice cracking. Frank leaned back in his chair and looked at her the way he did when he was thinking, not judging. Then he said something she didn't expect. He started talking about his first year farming, decades earlier. He told her about rolling a tractor and breaking his arm. about planting an entire field at the wrong depth and having to redo it, about backing a wagon through a barn door and knocking it clean off. He spoke plainly, without embellishment, like he was reciting weather again. Sarah listened, stunned. "Farming is mistakes," he said finally. "Constant mistakes. The difference is whether you learn from them or let them stop you." He leaned forward. "You think I'd fire my best worker because of one bad day?" The word best worker landed harder than any reprimand could have. Sarah felt tears spill over before she could stop them. "I thought I was failing," she said, the truth tumbling out. Frank shook his head. "You're succeeding," he said. "You made fewer mistakes in 3 months than most people make in a year. And you work twice as hard." He dismissed her then, not unkindly, as if the matter were settled. Sarah drove home with her face wet and her chest aching, the tension releasing all at once. She hugged Tommy that night longer than usual, breathing in the warmth of him, feeling the fever break under her palm. When he asked why she looked sad, she told him she'd had a hard day, but it was okay now. And it was, not because the day had gone well, but because someone she respected had refused to let her define herself by it. That was the last time Sarah seriously considered quitting. After that, when the work got hard, she remembered June 12th and the way Frank had told his stories, and she understood that persistence wasn't about being flawless, it was about staying. The rest of the summer tested that understanding again and again. Harvest loomed, bringing with it long hours and heavier machinery. The combine intimidated her in a way nothing else had. It was complex and unforgiving, and the cost of mistakes was higher. Frank trained her carefully, letting her take on more responsibility as her confidence grew. She studied manuals at night, quizzed herself while making dinner, asked questions that others might have been embarrassed to ask. Some of the men who had doubted her began to offer help without sarcasm. Others remained distant. Sarah didn't waste energy on either reaction. She focused on doing the job. During harvest, the days stretched into something almost surreal. Dawn bled into dusk, and dusk into night. The air filled with dust and the smell of grain. Sarah learned the particular exhaustion that comes from work that doesn't stop just because you're tired. One night, near the end of a 14-hour day, the combine failed again, and Sarah found herself in the dark field with Frank, tools spread out under portable lights. This time, she wasn't afraid. She watched, handed him tools, asked questions, and memorized the steps. When he finished, she realized it was past 1 in the morning. She went home, slept a few hours, and came back without complaint. Frank noticed. He always noticed. By the time harvest ended, Sarah had worked every day of it. Frank paid her overtime, and when she added it up later, the number stunned her. More than $4,000 from harvest alone. Enough to build a buffer. Enough to breathe. By October, the farm slowed, and with the slowing came reflection. Sarah looked at her life and saw stability where there had been panic. Bills were paid. The fridge was full. The kids had new coats. But the deeper change was internal. She trusted herself now in a way she hadn't before. She knew she could learn. She knew she could endure. When Frank called her into the office again that fall, her stomach still tightened, but not the way it had before. This time, when he talked about the future and her place in it, she listened without shrinking. She understood that June 12th hadn't been a breaking point. It had been a forging. The farm hadn't just taught her how to work. It had taught her how to stay standing when everything suggested she shouldn't, and that lesson would matter long after the dust settled and the fields went quiet. By the time winter edged in again, Sarah no longer felt like a visitor on Jensen Farm. She felt like part of its nervous system. One of the quiet connections that kept everything moving without drawing attention to itself. The fear that had once followed her through the yard every morning had faded into something more manageable, a steady alertness that sharpened her instead of paralyzing her. Frank relied on her now in ways that went beyond simple labor. He asked her opinion when planning schedules. He let her coordinate repairs instead of waiting for him to notice problems. When suppliers called, he sometimes handed her the phone and let her handle the conversation while he listened from across the office. The first time he did that, her heart pounded hard enough that she was sure he could hear it. But she kept her voice calm and stuck to facts, and when she hung up, Frank nodded like it was the most natural thing in the world. Trust arrived quietly, without ceremony, and Sarah understood that it was heavier than any machine she'd learned to operate. She didn't take it lightly. She arrived earlier than before, stayed later when needed, and filled the gaps without being asked. The men who worked under her direction noticed the shift even if they didn't comment on it. Instructions that once came from Frank now came from Sarah, and most of them followed without protest, because she never asked anyone to do work she wouldn't do herself. She learned to read people the same way she'd learned to read soil and weather, noticing who needed clear direction and who needed space, who responded to bluntness and who shut down under it. The farm ran smoother because of it, and Frank said so out loud one evening as they went over numbers at the kitchen table in the farmhouse. He told her profits were up, costs were down, and efficiency had improved. Sarah listened, trying not to let the words overwhelm her, because praise still felt like something that could be taken back if she relaxed too much. In 1985, Frank stepped back a little more. He let her manage the planting crew that spring, trusted her to make calls about timing that could mean the difference between a good yield and a bad one. She felt the pressure of those decisions settle into her shoulders, but she also felt ready in a way she hadn't been before. She checked forecasts obsessively, walked fields at dawn, and weighed risks with the same seriousness she'd once applied to every dollar in her purse. When things went right, she accepted it with quiet satisfaction. When something went wrong, she fixed it and moved on. There was no room for dramatics. Farming didn't care how you felt. By the end of that year, the farm had its best performance in a decade. Frank credited her openly, which embarrassed her but also changed how others saw her. She wasn't just the woman who'd shown up desperate and unqualified anymore. She was the reason things worked. In 1986, Frank made it official and promoted her to farm manager. The title felt almost unreal, like wearing clothes that were too big at first, but she grew into it. The pay increase changed her life in practical ways. She bought a reliable used car, a 1982 Ford Taurus. That started when she turned the key and didn't leave her listening for strange noises. She moved the kids into a better rental, 3 bedrooms in a quieter neighborhood, where Tommy and Lisa each had their own space. The pride she felt watching them unpack their things was sharp and clean, untainted by fear. But the biggest change wasn't visible. It was the way Sarah carried herself now, the way she met people's eyes without flinching, the way she spoke with certainty because she'd earned it. In 1987, Frank turned 65 and started talking about retirement more seriously. He didn't have children interested in taking over the farm, and the thought of selling it to someone who might strip it or change it beyond recognition weighed on him. He and Sarah talked about the future in a way that felt both practical and personal. She knew every inch of the operation by then, knew the rhythms and the risks, knew what the land needed and what it could give back. One afternoon that fall, Frank called her into the office and closed the door, the way he did when something important was coming. He didn't circle the point. He said he wanted to sell her the farm, owner-financed, paid over 20 years. He laid out the numbers calmly, as if discussing seed costs. Sarah felt her breath catch. The scale of it was overwhelming. A 500-acre farm. Nearly $1 million. She told him she couldn't afford the down payment, her voice barely steady. Frank asked how much she had saved. When she told him, he nodded and said he'd take it, that she could bring the rest when she could. He said the farm was worth more on the open market, but he'd rather see it go to someone who cared about it than to a stranger. Sarah cried then, openly and without apology, because the distance between where she'd started and where she was standing felt impossible to bridge any other way. They signed papers in January of 1988. Frank stayed on as a consultant, not because Sarah needed him to run things, but because some transitions deserved respect. He guided when asked, offered perspective when she wanted it, and stepped back when she didn't. By spring, Sarah was running the farm independently. The weight of ownership pressed on her differently than management had. Every decision now carried personal consequences, but it also brought a sense of alignment she'd never known. The work she put in came back to her directly. She hired 2 full-time workers and paid them well, because she remembered what it felt like to be desperate and unseen. She treated them with respect, because she knew how far that went. Both stayed for years. By 1990, the farm was operating at peak efficiency, grossing hundreds of thousands annually and netting enough to provide a comfortable life. Sarah paid down debt aggressively, refinanced when it made sense, and owned the land outright years ahead of schedule. She taught Tommy everything Frank had taught her when he joined the operation after agricultural college, handing over day-to-day management while she focused on the business side. Lisa became a veterinarian, proud of her mother in a way that felt almost surreal to Sarah, who still sometimes remembered counting coins at the kitchen table. In 2008, Sarah retired. The farm was worth millions by then. She sold it to Tommy at a family price, structured the deal the same way Frank had structured hers, because she understood the power of that kind of trust. When Frank Jensen died in 2009, Sarah spoke at his funeral. The church was packed, filled with people who'd been given a chance when they needed it most. She told the story simply, without embellishment. She said that in March of 1984, she'd had $42 and 11 days before eviction, and that 7 places had told her no because she had no experience. Frank had asked her one question instead. Would she quit when it got hard? She said no. She kept that promise. She said that decision changed everything, not because it was kind, but because it was honest. And as she stood there, looking out at the faces of people whose lives had intersected with that moment in a cold machine shed, she understood that the real legacy of Jensen Farm wasn't the land or the profits. It was the quiet, stubborn belief that determination mattered, and that sometimes all a person needed was someone willing to ask the right question and believe the answer. By the time Sarah Mitchell finally allowed herself to slow down, the habit of moving forward had already reshaped her into someone she barely recognized from the woman who once stood in a cold machine shed begging for a chance. Retirement did not arrive with fireworks or relief so much as with a quiet sense of completion, like setting down a heavy load you'd been carrying for so long you'd forgotten its weight. In 2008, at 59, Sarah stepped away from the daily grind of the farm, not because she was tired of the work, but because the work no longer needed her in the same way. The land was healthy. The operation was strong. The system she'd built ran without constant supervision. Tommy had grown into the role of farm manager naturally, not as a favor from his mother, but because he understood the land the way she had learned to, through attention and accountability. Sarah watched him move through the fields with a familiarity that mirrored her own years earlier. And the sight filled her with a pride that was steadier and deeper than anything she'd felt when she signed her first paycheck or bought her first reliable car. She sold the farm to him at a price below market, structured the financing the same way Frank Jensen had structured hers, because she understood something now that she hadn't then. Opportunity mattered more than maximizing profit. Lisa visited often, sometimes helping during busy seasons, sometimes just walking the fields with her mother, talking about animals and weather and the strange ways life bends when you stop fighting it and start working with it. Sarah spent her days differently now. She handled finances, advised when asked, and sat on the porch in the evenings watching the light fade across acres, she had once been terrified to touch. Her net worth on paper was impressive, a number that would have felt unreal to the woman who once counted out $42 on a kitchen table. But money had never been the thing that stayed with her. What stayed were the mornings she showed up afraid and worked anyway. The nights she studied manuals because ignorance felt heavier than exhaustion. The day everything went wrong and she learned that mistakes were not the end of the story. When Frank Jensen died in 2009 at the age of 87, the church in Webster City filled beyond capacity. Farmers stood shoulder to shoulder with people from town, with men and women who'd once been desperate and had found steady ground through his quiet decisions. Sarah spoke that day not because she wanted to be seen, but because the story mattered. She told it plainly, the way Frank would have wanted. She talked about March 1984, about 7 rejections in 9 days, about a handwritten sign at the post office and a question asked without judgment. She said that Frank hadn't hired her because she was qualified, because she wasn't, and that he hadn't saved her because he felt sorry for her. Because he didn't. He hired her because he believed her answer when she said she wouldn't quit. She told them that one question had changed her life, not by removing hardship, but by giving it meaning. Over the years that followed, Sarah continued to honor that belief in small, deliberate ways. She hired people others overlooked. A young man with no experience who promised to stay. A widow who needed work and didn't know where to start. A teenage single mother who showed up shaking and desperate and willing to do anything. She asked them all the same question Frank had asked her, and she listened to the answers. Some didn't last. Some surprised her. Many stayed for years. The retention on her farm far exceeded the industry norm, but Sarah never thought of it in terms of statistics. She thought of it in terms of faces and names and the quiet satisfaction of watching someone stand a little taller after being trusted. After Frank's funeral, she used part of her savings to establish a small fund to help people enter farming without traditional backgrounds, not as charity, but as a bridge. No experience required. Determination required. The fund helped dozens of people take their first steps into a life they'd been told wasn't for them. And years later, many were still farming, still showing up, still proving that persistence could carry you farther than credentials ever would. When Sarah told her story at community events, she never dressed it up. She didn't pretend the work was easy or that success was guaranteed. She said she'd had no advantages, no connections, no money, and that desperation had been her only fuel. She said that sometimes the 8th door opens when the first 7 close, and that the difference between those who make it through and those who don't often comes down to whether someone is willing to stay when it gets uncomfortable. She reminded people that experience could be taught, but character revealed itself under pressure. In quiet moments, alone on the porch as the sun dipped low, Sarah sometimes thought back to the woman she'd been, hands shaking in a farmyard, terrified of being sent away one more time. She wished she could tell her that the fear wouldn't disappear, but that it would become manageable, that it would sharpen instead of paralyze, that it would one day be replaced by a calm confidence built from surviving what once felt impossible. She understood now that her life hadn't changed because of luck or because someone rescued her. It had changed because one man asked the right question, and because she had answered honestly and then lived that answer every day for 24 years. Experience hadn't saved her. Determination had. And in the end, that was the legacy she cared most about leaving behind. Proof that people are more than their resumes. That desperate beginnings can lead to steady endings. And that sometimes the smallest decisions, made quietly in cold sheds and unremarkable towns, are the ones that echo the longest.